The river does not forgive, but it does remember. Ask anyone in Kalapani and they will tell you the water keeps a ledger of who it has fed and who it has taken. On the morning this story begins, the ledger was quiet. The river moved the way it always did before the heat of the day set in, slow, silver, indifferent. Smoke curled from the tea stall near the ghat, where Mira was already boiling her second pot of the morning. She did not need a clock. The fishermen's voices told her the hour, and this morning, one voice was missing. "No Ramish today," she called out to a boy hauling nets past her stall. "His knees again," the boy said, not stopping. "His daughter's gone down to check the boats instead." Mira's hand paused over the pot. She had known Ramish for 30 years, had watched him dive before his hair went gray, had watched the river take a little more from him each season, the way it does from every diver who stays too long. And she had watched Priya grow up on the same ghat steps, throwing pebbles into water her father had once called his second home. Priya was 22, and she had spent every one of those years in the shadow of two things: her father's reputation and her father's decline. Ramish had once been the finest pearl diver on this stretch of the river, a man who could hold his breath long enough to make the other divers nervous, who came up from the riverbed with oysters cupped in both hands like he was presenting gifts to a king. But the years underwater had worn grooves into his joints that no doctor in the district could smooth out. These days he mostly sat. Priya crouched at the pier, running her palm along the hull of her father's old diving boat, the wood soft with age in places, sound in others. She had done this every morning for a month now, checked the boat, oiled the rope, sharpened the small curved knife divers used to pry oysters loose from rock. She had not told her father why. She did not need to. Ramish already knew. He watched her from the doorway of their house on the slope above the ghat, leaning on the frame because his knees would not let him stand unsupported for long. "You're not going in that boat," he said, when she finally came up for breakfast. "I didn't say I was." "You don't have to say it. You've been oiling a rope that hasn't seen water in 4 years." Priya set 2 cups of tea on the low table between them and said nothing for a moment. Outside, a rooster somewhere down the slope announced the hour late, as always. "Someone has to dive this season," she said finally. "The buyers are coming in 6 weeks. If we don't have pearls, we don't have rent money we don't have." "We'll manage." "You always say that, and every year we manage a little less." Ramish's jaw tightened, the way it did whenever the conversation turned toward money or toward the river or, worse, toward both at once. "Divers are men, Priya. It's not a rule I made. It's a rule that's kept women out of the water for generations, and there are reasons for that, whatever you think of them." "Name one reason that isn't because that's how it's always been." He didn't have an answer ready, which she took, quietly, as a kind of victory. News in Kalapani traveled faster than the river current, and by the time the sun was fully up, Mira already knew the shape of the argument, if not the exact words. She heard it from the fishmonger's wife, who heard it from a boy who had been sitting too close to Ramish's window with a slingshot and no shame about eavesdropping. "She wants to dive," Mira said to Kavita, who had stopped by the tea stall on her way to the schoolhouse, papers tucked under one arm. "Priya?" Kavita raised an eyebrow, more curious than surprised. She had taught Priya as a girl, remembered her as the only student who asked, every single year, why the diving families never sent their daughters underwater when they clearly spent every waking hour near it anyway. "She's been at that boat every morning for a month," Mira said. Ramish finally noticed. And he said no. The way men like Ramish say no to things, like the conversation is already finished. Kavita glanced toward the ghat, where she could just make out Priya's shape, still crouched by the boat, working a knot loose with more force than the knot required. "Conversations like that are never really finished," she said. "They just wait for someone to bring them back up." That someone, as it turned out, was Arjun. He arrived at the ghat a little after midday, the way he always did, not to dive, not anymore, but to look. Some old habits outlive the body that formed them. Arjun had been the best diver in Kalapani a generation before Ramish, and though his hands now spent their days on boat repairs instead of oyster beds, the river still pulled at something in him every time he stood near it. He found Priya sitting on the pier, knees drawn up, staring at the water like it owed her an answer. "You'll wear a groove in that wood, sitting like that." Arjun said, lowering himself down beside her with the particular care of a man whose knees had also begun keeping their own ledger. He said no. I heard. You heard already, it's been 3 hours. Arjun almost smiled. This is Kalapani, news moves faster than the river. He nodded toward the water. You really want to go down there? I've wanted to since I was 7. I just never said it out loud, because I knew what the answer would be. Arjun was quiet for a while. Below them, the current pushed gently against the pier posts, the same sound it had made every day of his life. He thought of the accident, the one he never spoke about, the one that had ended his own diving years before his knees ever had the chance to. He thought of the diver he had lost that day and the years of silence that followed. He had never told anyone the full truth of what happened, not even Mira, who knew almost everything else about him. Diving isn't stubbornness, he said finally. It isn't proving a point to your father. Down there, the river doesn't care what point you're trying to make. It only cares whether you know what you're doing. So teach me. He looked at her for a long moment, searching, perhaps, for the same recklessness that had once cost him someone he loved. He didn't find it. He found something steadier instead. Your father can't know, Arjun said. Not yet, not until you're ready. So began the secret. Every morning, before the ghat filled with the noise of the day, Arjun and Priya went out in the old boat to a quiet bend of the river where the water ran deep, and the current was gentle enough to forgive mistakes. He taught her the things no one teaches from a chair. How to equalize the pressure building in her ears as she descended, how to read the color of the water for the current beneath the surface, how to let her body go loose instead of fighting the river's pull. You're wasting air, he told her, the first week, after she surfaced gasping far too soon. You're diving like you're afraid of the water. I am afraid of the water. Good, stay afraid. Fear keeps divers alive. It's the ones who stop being afraid that the river takes. He said it lightly, but something in his face told her this was not advice, it was a memory. By the second week, she could hold her breath for 1.5 minutes. By the third, nearly 3. Her hands learned the particular motion of prying an oyster free from rock without cutting herself on its edges, a motion Arjun's own hands still remembered perfectly, muscle memory outliving 30 years on land. Your father was better than me once, Arjun admitted one morning as they let the boat drift in the shallows. Faster underwater, steadier hands. I used to watch him and wonder how he made it look so easy. He never talks about it like that. Men like your father don't talk about the things they were good at, only the things that took it away from them. Arjun looked out at the water, his knees in his case. Mine was, he stopped. Yours was what? He didn't answer that day, but the question stayed between them, unresolved, the way the river keeps things it hasn't decided whether to give back. Word of the secret morning lessons did not stay secret for long, not in a village where Mira's tea stall functioned as an unofficial news bureau. It reached Ramesh on a warm evening 3 weeks in, delivered by Kavita herself, who had decided the conversation had waited long enough. She's been training with Arjun, Kavita said, sitting across from him on his own doorstep, a boldness she allowed herself only because she had known this family for years. You must know that by now. I know. And you haven't stopped her. Ramesh looked down at his hands, then out toward the darkening river. I told her no, she didn't listen. What was I supposed to do, chain her to the house? You could talk to her instead of at her. I've tried that. Have you told her why you're afraid, or only that you're against it? Ramesh didn't answer, and Kavita let the silence do the rest of the work, the way she often did with her most stubborn students. The truth, the thing Ramesh had never fully said aloud, even to himself, was that his fear had nothing to do with tradition. It had everything to do with the year Priya turned 9, when he had come up from a dive with blood in the water that wasn't his, and had to be the one to tell another family what the river had done. He had never dived with the same confidence again, and when his daughter started oiling that old rope, all he could think was, what if the ledger comes for her instead of me? The buyers were arriving in 5 weeks, and the village needed pearls. That was the fact standing behind every argument, patient and unmoved by anyone's feelings. The same fact that eventually pushed Ramesh down to the ghat one morning before sunrise, not to stop his daughter, but to watch her. He said nothing as Arjun helped her into the water, said nothing as she went under, said nothing as the seconds stretched past a minute and a half, past 2. His hands gripped the edge of the boat the way they used to grip his own rope decades ago. When Priya surfaced, breathless, triumphant, an oyster in each fist, she saw her father standing at the water's edge, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "How long were you watching?" she finally asked. "Long enough to see you didn't panic when the current shifted." "You saw that?" "I saw everything." Ramesh's voice was rough. "You dive like him?" He nodded toward Arjun, who suddenly found something very interesting to examine on the boat's hull. "Not like me. Better than me, maybe, in a few years." It was not quite permission. But it was not quite refusal either, and in a village like Kalapani, that was often how the largest changes began, not with a declaration, but with a silence that had finally stopped being an argument. 5 weeks passed the way they always do when a village is waiting for something, too slowly in the mornings, and far too quickly, by the time the buyer's boat actually appeared on the horizon. The tradition in Kalapani was old and simple. On the day the pearl buyers arrived, the village's divers competed for the honor of presenting the season's finest find, a ritual that decided not just prestige, but often the prices the buyers were willing to pay for the rest of the harvest. No woman had ever entered. Priya entered anyway. There were murmurs, of course. An old fisherman spat toward the water and muttered something about the river's patience finally running out. A few of the younger divers laughed, not unkindly, more from surprise than cruelty. But Ramesh stood beside his daughter at the ghat that morning, his hand on her shoulder, and said nothing to anyone who looked at him for an explanation. Arjun stood a few steps back, arms crossed, watching the water the way he always did before a dive, like it was an old friend he didn't fully trust. The competition went as competitions do, divers entering the water in turns, each surfacing with their find, the crowd murmuring approval or disappointment depending on the size and luster of what came up. Priya waited her turn near the end, her heart louder in her ears than the noise of the crowd. She was midway through her descent, the water darker here than in the practice cove, the current stronger, pulling sideways in a way Arjun's training coves had never quite prepared her for when she saw it. Not an oyster bed, but a boy, no older than 8, tangled in a length of old fishing net near the base of a submerged rock, his small body thrashing weakly, air long gone from his lungs. There was no time to surface for help. There was only the ledger, deciding, in that moment, what it wanted to take. Priya's training took over before her fear could. She kicked toward him, worked her diving knife into the net with the same steady motion Arjun had drilled into her hands for weeks, cut him free, and pulled him up toward the light with the last of her own air burning in her chest. They broke the surface together, the boy coughing water, Priya gasping, the crowd's murmur turning instantly to shouting, some running for the boy's mother, others simply staring at the woman who had just done, without hesitation, the thing every diver trains for and hopes never to need. Ramesh reached the water first, pulling both of them onto the ghat steps, his hands shaking in a way 30 years of diving had never made them shake. Arjun was a half step behind him, and for one long moment, the two old divers simply looked at each other over Priya's soaked, exhausted shoulders. Two men who had spent decades not talking about the same fear, now watching it resolve itself in front of them. The boy's mother arrived screaming his name, and then weeping, and then thanking Priya in the broken, repetitive way people thank someone who has just handed them back their whole world. The pearl buyers, to their credit, did not need the oyster Priya never surfaced with. They had seen something in the water that mattered more than any pearl the village could offer that season, and the story of it would travel with them to the next village, and the next, the way stories about Kalapani always did. That evening, the tea stall was fuller than Mira had ever seen it, every voice retelling the same story with a slightly different flourish. Kavita sat near the back, quietly satisfied in the way people are when a stubborn question has finally answered itself. Arjun sat beside Ramesh, 2 cups of tea between them, neither man saying much, which was, for both of them, its own kind of conversation. "You were watching the whole time," Ramesh finally said. "Weren't you, every practice?" "Everyone. Why didn't you tell me?" Arjun turned his cup slowly in his hands. "Because I once let fear stop someone from being ready, and I've spent 30 years wishing I hadn't. I wasn't going to make that mistake twice. Ramish didn't ask what he meant. Some ledgers, he understood now, were not his to read. Priya became, from that day forward, the first woman diver Kalapani had ever known by name instead of rumor. She would go on to train others, girls who had grown up watching the water the way she once had, wondering why it was only ever theirs to fetch from, never to enter. But that is a story for a later season. For now, the river kept its ledger the way it always had: quiet, indifferent remembering. And somewhere in it, alongside the names of what it had taken, it had, for once, also written down what it had given back. End of episode 1.